meeting you right where you are on your foster care journey. This is the Forgotten Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Forgotten Podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Cabe, and I am so happy to be with you. If you are part of the foster care community, passionate about serving, or simply interested in learning more, we are here for you. In every episode of this podcast, you're going to hear from men and women who've experienced foster care to one degree or another. They may have grown up in the system, are caseworkers or foster parents, or other people who are here to bring you hope and encouragement. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe and share with a friend. Remember, you are not alone. I hope you enjoy the Forgotten Podcast. Well, hey, Peter, I'm so happy to have you on the show today. We actually met through a mutual friend and quickly recognized that we share a lot of similarities, a lot of similar passions, especially, particularly around foster care. And you believe, and I do too, all kids should grow up in a family. And your heart especially burns for the thousands of teenagers in our country who are growing up alone. So I'm so thankful that you're on the show today. I can't wait to explore this topic. And I also want to hear your vision for making a difference for our nation's teens. So let's start right here. What kindled this passion of yours in the very first place?
Well, foster care really was something that my wife and I always had an interest in adopting, and we had both spent some time in Africa. And so we thought we would adopt internationally at some point, but we were living in Boston, and we had... I guess it was me who had this moment of saying, well, there's a ton of kids here, although neither of us knew anything about foster care at the time, but I assumed there were tons of kids here in Boston that needed families too. And so, there were concerns for me about international adoption. So I just said, let's take the classes, let's learn about foster care. So that's really where it started. Fast forward, 5 years down the road, we've been foster parents for 5 years. We've adopted a few, but we had our first teenager placed with us, and he was 17 years old. And that was really the eye-opening kind of experience for us, was because we learned most of the teenagers end up living in institutional type settings and not ending up being adopted or getting to be part of a family once they age out of the system. And so many of those teenagers, and the statistics are pretty staggering, but really bad outcomes. Not having a family is not a good thing. And so I think that was just the kind of moment for us of realizing, like, this is something we got to do something more about. So.
So before we go a little bit more into your journey, what are some of those outcomes that are typical? What are some of the statistics?
Well, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but a very high proportion will be in prison or homeless within a couple of years. Most of the, it's more than half of the teen girls will be pregnant within a few years. It's really just really bad outcomes. But, if you imagine back to you being an 18-year-old, having no family, no support system, no social network in the world, and then being expected to take care of yourself, it's a pretty tough, even for a healthy, functional kid with no trauma who comes from, it would be tough. And I think, working a minimum wage job, trying to pay rent, just trying to survive would be really hard. But then you layer on trauma and abuse and all the things that these kids have been through, abandonment, and then try to do that, and you see where those outcomes happen.
Right. And a lot of them also enter, a lot of these girls, and probably some of these guys too, but enter into sex trafficking, human trafficking, and all of that because they are so vulnerable, like you talked about.
Oh, totally. They have a target on their back.
They do. Yeah. I'm thinking about my daughter. My oldest is 18. And she's going to be moving out, hopefully next year. That's her plan. And she's asking me, I want to learn how to grocery shop and meal prep and things like that. And these are the things that healthy kids who've grown up in healthy families get to think about. Right. A lot of our teens, they're not afforded that luxury, right? They're thinking, how am I going to survive?
Right.
It's heartbreaking. And so you and your wife determined, obviously we can't do we can't take care of everybody, but you chose we can take care of one. We can start there. And how has that been? What has that been like, bringing a 17-year-old young man into your home?
Well, so it was 4 years ago. So at the time we would have had 4 little kids. Now we have 5, but our oldest is now 9. So he would have been 5. So we would have had 4 kids, 5 and under. And, there's all these kind of fears of, when a teenager comes into your home, you get the rap list and all the, all the things that have ever happened in their life. And I think it was easy to kind of have this fear of what could happen. I have to protect my kids. This isn't a wise decision, yada, yada, yada. And I mean, at some level, it's just kind of a step of faith. You don't know what's going to happen. And, there are lots of legitimate fears, but I think there's also, I think a lot of it is also just scarier than it looks. Like at the end of the day, these are just little kids in big kid bodies who need families, who need parents. And, like bigger kids have bigger kid problems, like the police and, all the Baker Acts and all the kind of, involuntary hospitalizations, all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, they're still just little kids. And even, their biological age may be a teenager, but in many ways, their emotional age they're right there with my other kids. They need stability and they need attachment and they need all the things that they didn't get as a kid. And so I think that is, kind of our learning as we go. But
yes, I think that's such a key thing to mention. That's something I remember my husband Clint and I, when we were in foster parenting classes, that's one of the things we'll never forget from them, is learning about the difference between physical age, developmental age, and then experiential age. So a lot of our kids, right, they physically might be 8 years old, developmentally maybe 3 or 4, experientially maybe 50 or 60, right? Or things that none of us have ever experienced. So it helps us understand. It doesn't make it easier, right? But like you said, it helps you learn more and understand like why they might be acting the way they are.
Yep. Right. Exactly.
What are some ways, and this might be a difficult question, so, but what are some ways you've seen kind of that lived out, like the difference between, he's 17, but he's acting in a younger way?
I mean, I think some of the challenges are, we go on a family vacation, he disappears the night before, the kind of stuff like that where it's just, he doesn't know what to do with that, kind of, it's uncomfortable. I think there are a multitude of examples. Obviously, I don't really want to go into details about my own kids.
And Peter, I can pause this right here because as I said that did feel a little bit weird. Maybe we can make it just general.
Generic.
So let me start that over. What are some ways let me see. What would you say are some examples of how kids that we've talked about, kids who have, a different experiential age or developmental age than their current age, how can that play out? What are some ways?
I think one of the potential big things is attachment. So I think these kids in their head are always expecting to be going to the next placement, waiting for you to kick them out, waiting for, kind of just to be moved along like they have their whole life. So I think kind of, maybe to answer your question in a different way, I think as a foster parent, our responsibility is to show up and keep showing up and keep showing up because these kids don't expect us to.
Yeah. I also think about kids who are, especially you're thinking of like teenagers, that haven't had those building blocks of when you cry, someone comes, when you're sad, someone listens, right? And I've seen this with our kids at different seasons of life, right? Like developmentally around 10, a lot of my kids who've been adopted have had more questions and they're starting to think more abstractly and asking questions that I may or may not know the answer to. And kids who are that same age physically, we have some that have developmentally are a little delayed. And so those questions and those feelings have come not necessarily at 10, but maybe at 12 or 13 or 14, but they're the same. Like it's sometimes hard to see your older kid struggling in that way, and you can naturally go, you're a teenager, you shouldn't be thinking like this or talking like this. But the reality is, developmentally, they aren't yet, right?
Yeah, another example I would give is I think these kids are not used to having somebody who is looking out for them, who is kind of has their back. And so, like you said, these kids are targets for sex traffickers, 100%. Like, I mean, the vast majority of kids who are sex trafficked come through the foster system, but these kids who grow up with minimum wage shift workers as their parents, they don't care if, you're going to the mall, you're working as long as you get back by the time you're supposed to be back. Whereas a parent wants to know, who are you going to be with? What are you doing? Who's driving you there, et cetera. And that, that's the reason they're a target, is because they don't have a parent who's doing those things. So I think when you first start doing those things, a kid who's used to the freedom, the quote unquote freedom that they think they want, they're going to push back against it because they're used to being able to come and go whenever they want and do kind of whatever they want with limited accountability. And I think so parents, they need that, but they're not going to like it. And so there's a challenge to that. But I think that it's really important role for us to play.
Yeah.
So
I think that's such a great point there. It's uncomfortable because it's not what many of our kids have known.
Yep.
Yeah. When we talk about, you mentioned some of those very real fears, right? And it's natural for us as humans to worry. It's also natural for us to talk about or get angry about the problems we see in this world, but it's also easy to just do nothing. As the saying goes, talk is cheap. But the needs are real. Like, there are ways we can get involved in bringing about solutions. What would you say are some of those ways? Obviously raising your hand and stepping in, but what are some other ways as well?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're trying to do here in Central Florida is to make sure all of the teenagers are connected with mentors and people who will be an active part of their life. So at different levels of kind of engagement, but so I serve on the board of our local foster care agency, and we're working really hard to have mentors for all of our teenagers to make sure that they're almost like a parent type figure. If we can't get them into a family, at least we can get a kind of long-term adult presence in their life. So I think that's one great way to plug in. Another way is to serve the foster families who are taking in teens. So another thing we've done here in Central Florida is to kind of create care communities around the teen families specifically, trying to kind of expand their capacity, help, with take a kid for an overnight or take them out to do something, bring them meals, some of that stuff I think just really expands the capacity of the caregiver, but also like gives them the assurance like, hey, we're in your corner, like we know you're doing a hard thing and we're going to try to help you do it better. So that's some of the stuff we've done here.
I think that's huge. And it also, we say often here at TFI, awareness leads to action. How have you seen, and maybe not yet, but likely someday, but have you seen those people who are in the care community turn into a family who's bringing a teen in themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think lots of our friends have become foster parents, although not a lot have become
cool.
teen foster parents. But, just seeing our family and getting to know us, it kind of demystifies the process at some level, but it also, I think just proximity and being around these kids is like, it's hard not to, fall in love with the kids. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. Stepping into this work, and we've talked a little bit about this, but it's not safe. It's not, quote, safe. It's not, quote, the easy path. What have been some of the challenges you have experienced?
Personally, as a caregiver?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that there's not a book for how to raise a teen. I've never had a teen. So last I know about being a teenager was when I was one. And so for me, I've slowly been learning about all the various trauma and all the things that, kids in the foster care system have been through and how that might impact them. But, as with my oldest at 5 at the time, and then a 17-year-old, it's just a very different,
Big difference.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so we've had to navigate through lots of healthcare stuff and lots of, substance abuse and just so many different, there's a lot of different pieces that I haven't been exposed to previously. And so kind of figuring out the mental health side of things is like huge. And kind of getting, kids, teenagers, just a little note here, but, probably aren't going to be interested in going to counseling. But, I think there can be real value there, but also working with psychiatrists. And, often I think a lot of these kids will be on some sort of psychotropic meds and, just navigating that whole world has its own challenges and figuring out, like, is this the right kind of treatment or is this, over just drugging the kids or what? I don't know. So
Right.
all of that is just a
Yeah.
challenge. I mean, my wife's a physician, luckily for me, so that helps for me to navigate that. But I think it can be
Yes.
quite complicated if you're,
Mhm.
just a regular person like me. So
Well, and I remember when we talked previously, but you sung your wife's praises. Isn't she very trauma informed and has helped you
she is for sure.
learn a lot of that?
Yeah, I would
Yeah.
say she's done a lot more of the reading and learning around kind of how to respond to trauma, for us to be better parents, like how we treat our biological kids, and our adopted kids are actually different in many ways. And I think that is, that comes from her for sure, a lot more than me. So I learned through her.
That's awesome. Well, with the challenges, right? I mean, you could have chosen a different path, but why do you continue? Why do you choose this path?
Well, I think for me personally, it seems like when you look at Jesus's life, he wasn't going to the easy or to the kind of where there were no problems. And I think for me personally, there are in Central Florida 150 teenagers who live in institutional group home settings, and there's 2.5 million people here. And so to me, it's just mind-boggling that we can't. There's 1,300 churches, so the fact that we can't get those 150 kids into families kind of blows my mind, and it's sort of my mission in life is to put that number to zero. I know there will always be new ones coming in, and so it's a long-term kind of goal. But it just feels like if Jesus was here today in the flesh, I feel like he would be in the space trying to figure out how to serve, the quote least of these. I don't love that term to refer to these kids, but that's how the world views them. And so I think that's where I feel like God's calling us.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're a numbers guy in general, right?
Yep.
So those numbers, just on a piece of paper, that's an easy problem
Right.
to fix, right?
It does seem so easy. 150, we just need 1 out of 10 churches to raise their hand to take one kid, and there you go, we're done. So,
Yeah.
not to simplify it, it's certainly not simple, but
Yes,
but I still
right.
think I know that those kids are still just little kids who need parents, just like anybody. So, while I don't think all of those kids will probably end up being able to live and succeed in a home, I think the vast majority can. So,
How do you feel like your strengths and your natural giftings have helped you in this work?
it's been interesting. So I kind of wear a few hats. I'm a foster parent, obviously, but then so I kind of that's my micro level hat, for our now 21-year-olds, and for all of our, we have 3 others adopted out of the foster system, and then I wear a hat of kind of like you said, I'm an economist by training, and so I'm on the board of directors of the group that oversees foster care here in the 3 counties and around Orlando. And so I'm always pushing us to figure out how to solve this issue. And there's been some really like good stuff happening. We're connecting. I mean, in many ways, I've become a connecting point between the local church and Embrace Families, which is just they get dollars from DCF. It's a different name in each state, but the the social service division at the state level funds Embrace Families to run the foster care system. And so because it's a private nonprofit, I'm there. They have a board of directors. And so I've gotten to play the role of connecting the church and Embrace Families. So our care communities, a lot of that is happening, but it's happening together with the church and Embrace Families. So I'm excited to see the groups working together rather than just kind of creating silos like, okay, well, we're going to go do this and the government's going to do their thing. We're going to do our thing, and the two will never mix. I think it's really great to see that happening. And so one exciting thing that's happening right now that is not, it's just in process. And so who knows what will come of it, but working with a local church who said, we're interested in helping to solve this group home thing. And so what they are going to do is rent 2 houses. They're going to get 2 families who will be basically missionary families to live and give a 3-year commitment, live in those houses. They're going to connect each of the kids with a mentor. So maybe 5 kids per house, put a mentor with each of the 10 kids, and ultimately with the hope of adopting all those kids out, hopefully to their mentors, but kind of seeing if we can do a little better, kind of getting, so that could take 10 kids out of group homes and get them on the path. We're hoping to kind of get 15-year-olds, so there's kind of that 3 or 4 year window to kind of get them in a steady home, kind of going to church with the family, and then hopefully, connecting with an adoptive family. So that's something that we're proposing. I actually have a meeting with them tomorrow with Embrace Families to pitch the idea. So it's just there's cool stuff happening, but it's and it's fun to see the local church kind of starting to step up and hopefully do some of that.
Get behind it. Yeah, we have to work together. We all have our own strengths, right? We all have our own areas that we're weak in, and so we need each other, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I'm going to take it on the opposite side. What have you learned through your weaknesses, through things that have been uncomfortable or aren't naturally what you're good at in this journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where God's growing us, certainly, is just this whole idea that I talked about earlier of continuing to show up is kind of goes against my natural inclination. So it's certainly much easier to say, okay, this didn't work, that's too bad. But for me, I know intellectually that I need to keep showing up, and that how important that is. I know it's important for my own life. It's important for anybody, but especially so much more so for kids who've gone through the trauma of being abandoned by their parents. So I think that it's a work in progress for me, but it helps to have a teammate with my wife who, yes. we alternate in frustration, and it helps to have somebody encouraging you to continue. So
very true.
And I will say, I mean, I don't know if this is to answer your weakness question, but my there's been a lot of frustration with the local church to kind of not solving this, where I'm like, there's 150 and 1,300, like, I don't get it. But at the same time, it's just a slow slog, and I think that's not something I'm good at or comfortable with either. But I think continuing to push in and not give up is, it's exciting to see what's happening now, and that wouldn't have happened without the groundwork of like the last 4 years of not a lot of progress, but building a lot of relationships. So, it's just, things don't go as fast as I would like, but when it comes to like human lives and taking kids into your home, those aren't simple kind of problems, with simple answers. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm relationship is key, and that does take time, and it is messy, and it goes, it's slow. Yep. But it does pay big dividends, and you're starting to see that. That's exciting. Would you say, Peter, that you've experienced more of Jesus as you've engaged in this foster care work?
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, the idea of like, in losing your life, you find it is, I think very applicable here. because from an external perspective, it seems like, why don't you just want biological kids who, are going to be doctors and whatever, and I think just the idea that we are not kind of following the traditional script of what the world tells us we should value and what we should do. We find so much joy in that. I mean, not because of that, but it's very countercultural to, love kids from hard places. It's hard, but it's super rewarding. So, you kind of find the joy in it as you do it. So that you have to kind of the doing it part to experience the joy. So it's kind of like in losing your life, you find it. I think we've found to be true. I mean, we've found that to be true the same way with giving, as we give, we kind of, as you give it away, you find it, you find life. So it's kind of opposite of what, every commercial tells you. So
totally.
Yeah.
And it's opposite of human nature too,
For sure.
right? It's like it doesn't make logical sense,
Right.
and yet it's God's upside down kingdom.
It is, and it's the trust factor of, I'm gonna step into this. You don't get you don't get to experience the joy of it until you kind of step into it and trust. And I think that is, it's not easy. I won't say it's easy.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, and don't you think too, your passion grows as you see it? I mean, I remember when we first started thinking about adoption and we thought maybe this was something we're supposed to do and we had a bit of a desire for it. I remember saying to my husband, I want to know for sure that this is what we're supposed to do. And he's like, if God says it's a good thing in the Bible and he's given us an inclination to move forward, then I think that's all. We just move forward.
Yeah.
And now looking back, our son that we first adopted is now 15 and he was 10 months. Now I'm crazy passionate about adoption,
Yeah.
but I didn't know. I just took the next step.
Yep.
And I think I hope that's helpful to our listeners, that you don't have to feel like you have the full passion and you're ready to go. It's like, it's faith, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Have you experienced
I agree.
that same thing?
I think that, I'm sure you've heard this 1,000 times, people saying, I could never, do what you're doing. And I think that it's not true, and I often say that to people. It depends who I'm talking to, but, I often say you could do it, it's a choice not to. And I think that, I don't think, like you said, you need a magic kind of writing in the sky to tell you to do this. God's heart is for the orphan and the widow. And this is bullseye of so much that Jesus talked about and is central to the gospel. And I think, stepping into that is never going to be a bad thing. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious, what do people say when you say you could, when you put it back on them?
The end
How
of
does
the
that go for you?
I think they get the point though of, yeah, that's a hard thing, but at the same time, it's a conscious choice. If you want to step into this, you can. I mean, you've got to make decisions and sacrifices to enable yourself to do that. But I think that it is something that this isn't just for some elite group. And the great thing is you don't have to be wealthy. You don't have to be whatever. You just have to show up and love kids. I pretty much, most people can do that. It's not easy, but it's not something that you have to be from a certain social class or have a certain size house or whatever. So
yeah, absolutely. What would you say is one next step our listeners could take today or in the next week to move towards this?
Well, I think wherever you happen to be, I think there are often groups of churches who are passionate about this issue. So I would say that would be a great place to start. I know CAFO is I don't even know what it stands for.
Christian Alliance for
Thank
Orphans.
you. I know there's lots of
I got you.
alliances and groups like that in lots of different communities. So I would start there because I think a lot of those churches are going to be the best connection point. But you can always start with, if you're interested in being a mentor to a teen, I guarantee you if you call whatever case management agency does foster care in your area, they'd be happy to plug you in. So I know personally for us at Embrace Families, we were paying people to be mentors because we just had so few volunteers. And when we had to cut back our budget a couple of years ago, we just said, we need more volunteers. Like, we have such a huge need. So I know from our personal experience, I can't imagine it's different in other places. I think that there's just a huge need. So like, if you want to raise your hand and say, hey, I'll hang out with the kid once a week or once every couple of weeks, I think you won't have a hard time finding a place to plug in.
And it's worth asking, right?
Absolutely. So
you won't know unless you ask.
And the teenager issue is, is across our country. It's the biggest issue in foster care in my opinion. So it's not like in some counties this is taken care of.
Right.
So,
right.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, Peter, do you have any just final words of exhortation or encouragement to those who are listening today?
I really think kind of digging into the scripture about what God cares about, justice and the orphan and the widow. I think that there's just a lot there to kind of dig into, and kind of, I think, then taking that practically and thinking about what does that actually mean in our life. And, I think there's so many entry points. So another entry point, really, like this care community model. I know this came out of something called Promise 686 out of Atlanta. They're all different names all over the country, but there's a bunch of them too. And the idea is really just, can you bring a meal once a month to a foster family? And so I think, that level of commitment, I think pretty much everybody can do. And I think that's another way to getting involved and engaged. But I would say, if God's calling you to take a step, take a step, even if it's a small one. So, start learning, and, there's tons of great resources to learn more about what's happening kind of across the country. But I think, just understanding what God's heart is for the orphan is, that's a great first step.
Yeah, really get it, understand it in your own heart.
Yeah.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for your time today and just for your heart for our nation's teens. I've loved talking with you, and I'm excited to see what happens in Central Florida.
Yeah, well, if it's successful, maybe I can come back in a year and try. If it's not, then I won't.
There you go. Well, I hope today's episode was an encouragement to you wherever you are on this foster care journey. Now, we want you to stay connected, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Also, we have a ton of great content for you over at theforgotteninitiative.org. Thank you for watching, and I can't wait to see you next time.